On May 20th, 2021, the royal family faced a moment almost impossible to imagine. Prince William sat alone in front of a camera and delivered a statement about his mother, Princess Diana. There was no press conference, no carefully managed interview, just William, speaking directly to the public. And what he said was far more serious than a complaint about an old television program. He said the interview had never been legitimate. He said it should never be shown again. And most importantly, he said the deception surrounding it had contributed to the fear, paranoia, and isolation his mother experienced during the final years of her life. That statement changed the way many people looked at one of the most famous royal scandals of the 1990s. Because for decades, the story seemed simple. Charles and Diana had fallen out of love. There was an affair. There was bitterness. There were newspaper headlines. And eventually there was divorce. But underneath that familiar story was something much darker. A television interview. A journalist desperate to get access to Diana. And one piece of fake evidence that opened the door. A document that was never real. Yet it helped set off a chain of events that would change Diana's life forever. To understand how it happened, we have to go back to the beginning. Charles and Diana's engagement was announced in February 1981. She was just 19. Charles was 32. On paper, they looked like the perfect royal couple. But in reality, they were two very different people entering a marriage under enormous public pressure. Diana was young, inexperienced, and suddenly being prepared for a life she could barely understand. Charles had already spent years preparing for the role that waited for him. Then came the wedding. July 29th, 1981. St. Paul's Cathedral. Hundreds of millions of people around the world watched. The dress became legendary. The balcony kiss became an image that would define royal weddings for generations. To the public, it looked like a fairy tale. But the people inside that fairy tale were still trying to understand each other. And the problems did not take long to appear. Charles already had a complicated emotional history. Diana eventually realized that the relationship she feared was not simply a memory from the past. The affair with Camilla became one of the central wounds in the marriage. By the early 1990s, the private problems were no longer private. The newspapers were watching everything. Every photograph, every rumor, every argument, every possible sign of trouble. And Diana soon discovered something important. The press could hurt her, but it could also give her something the palace could not. A voice. The royal institution had advisors, officials, private secretaries, and courtiers. Diana had newspaper front pages, and she learned how powerful those front pages could be. In 1991, material that became the basis of Andrew Morton's book about Diana began moving quietly between Kensington Palace and the outside world. Diana did not simply sit down for a normal interview. Instead, tapes were secretly recorded through an arrangement involving her friend James Colthurst. Questions were passed to her. She answered them. The recordings were then taken away. Eventually, they reached Andrew Morton. When Diana, her true story was published in 1992, the impact was enormous. Suddenly, the public was hearing a completely different version of royal life. The book discussed her unhappiness, her struggles, her marriage, and the pressure surrounding her. The palace denied that Diana had cooperated. But years later, the tapes made the truth much harder to hide. Diana had been speaking, and she wanted the world to hear her side. Then the crisis became even bigger. Private telephone conversations began appearing in newspapers. First came a recording involving Diana and a close male friend. Then came the infamous recording involving Charles and Camilla. The private lives of the royal couple had become public entertainment. And newspapers were making money from every minute of it. By the end of 1992, the marriage was effectively finished as a private relationship. But legally, it was not over. On December 9th, 1992, the government announced that Charles and Diana had separated. Notice the word, separated. Not divorced. Diana was still Princess of Wales. And technically, she could still become queen one day. But everyone understood that the situation could not continue forever. Charles gave his famous television interview in 1994. He admitted that he had been unfaithful. Diana remained silent for a while longer. Then came 1995. And that was the year everything changed. Because a journalist named Martin Bashir wanted something almost every journalist in Britain wanted: access to Diana. But Diana was difficult to reach. She trusted very few people. Her brother, Charles Spencer, was one of them. So Bashir needed a way through that door. And this is where the story takes a shocking turn. Bashir presented documents to Charles Spencer that appeared to show secret payments being made to people connected with his family. The documents suggested that members of the household were being paid to provide information. But there was a problem. The documents were fake. They had been created as mock bank statements. The person who made them reportedly believed they were being prepared for a pitch. But Bashir used them to gain credibility with Spencer. And it worked. Spencer believed the information was serious. He trusted the journalist. And eventually, he introduced Bashir to his sister, Diana. That meeting opened the door to one of the most famous interviews in British television history. But the fake documents were only the beginning. According to later investigations, Bashir also told Diana other things that were not true. He claimed her phones were being monitored. He suggested people around her were secretly reporting on her. He made claims about people close to her family. For someone already living under enormous pressure, those claims could have a devastating effect. Imagine being told that the people working around you cannot be trusted. Imagine believing your own staff might be watching you. Imagine thinking even your private conversations are no longer private. And then imagine being surrounded by cameras and newspapers waiting for the next sign that something is wrong. That was the environment Diana was living in. And this is where the story becomes especially disturbing. Because the more frightened she became, the more suspicious she appeared. And the more suspicious she appeared, the more people believed the stories being told about her. It became a cycle. Make someone afraid. Watch them react. Then use that reaction as evidence that they were unstable. By November 1995, Diana was ready to speak publicly. The interview aired on BBC Panorama. Millions watched. And Diana said the words that would become permanently connected with her story. She spoke about her marriage. She spoke about Charles and Camilla. She spoke about her personal struggles. And she questioned whether Charles was suitable to become king. That final point was enormous. The affair was already public. Charles had already admitted it. But Diana had now challenged the future king in front of the entire country. The marriage could not realistically survive after that. Within weeks, Queen Elizabeth urged both Charles and Diana to move toward divorce. And in August 1996, the divorce became final. Diana remained Diana, Princess of Wales. But she lost the style Her Royal Highness. She was free from the marriage. But she was still one of the most watched women in the world. And then, just 1 year later, everything changed again. On August 31st, 1997, Diana died in a car crash in Paris. She was only 36. Her death shocked the world. Millions of people poured into London. Flowers covered the streets around Kensington Palace. The public reaction was so enormous that it created an unprecedented crisis for the monarchy itself. At first, Buckingham Palace followed its traditional rules. The Queen was at Balmoral. The royal standard remained there. But outside the palace, people were asking a different question. Why wasn't the flag at half-mast? For many ordinary people, the symbolism was painful. Diana was gone. Yet the palace appeared distant. The newspapers turned against the institution. The public demanded a response. Eventually, the Union flag flew above Buckingham Palace at half-mast. And Queen Elizabeth appeared on television to speak about Diana. The funeral became one of the biggest public events Britain had ever seen. William and Harry walked behind their mother's coffin. Millions watched. And inside Westminster Abbey, Charles Spencer delivered one of the most powerful speeches of the entire story. He described Diana as someone who had been relentlessly pursued by the media. He promised that her sons would be protected from being completely shaped by the institution she had struggled with. The world moved on. But the questions surrounding Diana's Panorama interview did not disappear. They remained buried for years. And this is where the story takes another unexpected turn. The journalist who obtained the interview continued his career. The program became famous. Awards followed. Bashir's reputation grew. But inside the BBC, concerns about how the interview had been obtained had already existed. There had been questions about the fake documents. There had been concerns about the process. An internal investigation took place in the 1990s. But the matter was not properly resolved. Years passed. Diana was gone. The interview remained famous. And the people who had raised concerns were left with unanswered questions. Then, decades later, Charles Spencer still had something that could change the story.
His diary.
He had kept his notes from the meeting with Bashir. He remembered what he had been shown. He remembered the documents. And eventually, those records became part of a new investigation. In 2020, the BBC commissioned Lord Dyson to examine what had happened. The investigation looked at the fake documents, Bashir's conduct, and the BBC's original handling of the allegations. Then, on May 20th, 2021, the report was released. The findings were devastating. The investigation concluded that Bashir had acted deceitfully. The fake bank statements had been used to gain access to Diana through her brother. And the BBC's original investigation had failed badly. The story that had been treated as settled for more than 2 decades was suddenly back in the headlines. The BBC apologized. Awards connected to the interview were returned. Compensation was paid to people who had been wrongly affected. And the BBC said the interview would no longer be broadcast. Then came the statements from Diana's sons. William spoke publicly about the damage the interview had caused. He said it had helped create a false narrative around his mother. He said the deception had contributed to the fear, paranoia, and isolation she experienced during her final years. Harry also issued a statement. His words went even further, connecting the culture surrounding the media and his mother's treatment with the tragedy that followed. And suddenly, people were forced to look at Diana's story differently. For decades, the public had been told a simple version: a troubled marriage, an unhappy princess, a powerful institution, an aggressive press, and a tragic ending. But the later investigation added another layer. There were people outside the marriage who had their own interests. There were journalists chasing access. There were newspapers making money from private pain. There were fake documents. And there were claims presented to Diana that were later found to be false. None of this erases the problems that already existed between Charles and Diana. Their marriage had serious problems long before Bashir entered the picture. The affair was real. The unhappiness was real. The separation was real. The divorce was real. But the question is what happened during the final years. Did outside manipulation make an already broken situation even worse? Did Diana become more isolated because she was encouraged to distrust the people around her? And how much did that isolation shape the decisions she made? Those questions are far more complicated than the fairy tale version of the marriage. Because perhaps the darkest part of the story is not that Charles and Diana hurt each other. They clearly did. It is that while their marriage was falling apart, an entire industry was growing around them. Photographers chased them. Newspapers sold their private moments. Television programs turned their pain into ratings. And journalists competed to get closer to Diana. Everyone wanted a piece of the story. But the cost was paid by real people. Diana, Charles, William, Harry, and countless others who became part of the story without choosing it. Years later, William was old enough to look back at what happened to his mother and discover that some of the things she feared had not simply existed inside her imagination. The investigation confirmed that serious deception had taken place. And that changes the meaning of one word that followed Diana for years: paranoia. Because if someone is repeatedly told that people are watching them, betraying them, and secretly reporting on them, and some of those claims are deliberately fabricated, then the story becomes much more complicated than simply saying that person was unstable. The tragedy is that Diana never lived long enough to see the full truth come out. She never saw the investigation. She never heard the BBC apologize. She never knew that decades later, the very interview that made her one of the most famous women on television would become an example of journalistic misconduct. And that may be the most painful part of all. The truth arrived. But it arrived too late. Her sons had to grow up carrying the consequences. The public had to reconsider what it thought it knew. and the BBC had to confront a decision that had remained hidden for a quarter of a century. So when people talk about Charles and Diana's marriage, they often focus on the affair. They focus on Camilla. They focus on the divorce. They focus on Diana's famous television interview. But perhaps the bigger story is what happened around the marriage. Because their private problems were real, yet other people turned those problems into an industry. And in the end, one fake document helped open a door that led to one of the most famous interviews in history. A television interview that changed the royal family. A television interview that changed Diana's public image. And decades later, an investigation that forced the institution behind it to admit that the way it had been obtained was wrong. That is why the story still matters. Not because Charles and Diana had a perfect marriage. They did not. Not because every tragedy can be blamed on one journalist. It cannot. But because the truth shows how easily private pain can become public business. And once that machine starts moving, stopping it can become almost impossible. Diana spent years trying to find a voice outside the palace. She found one. But the people helping her find that voice were not always telling her the truth. And that is the part of her story that took more than 20 years to fully uncover. The marriage was already broken. But the question that remains is much darker. How much worse did it become because outsiders learned exactly which fears to feed? And perhaps that is the question that will keep the Charles and Diana story alive for generations. Because sometimes the most shocking part of a royal scandal is not what happened in front of the cameras. It is what happened before the cameras were ever switched on.